I know there's a lot of interest in this subject, which is why 30 members have raised a total of 57 questions from the last sitting and this sitting. So I will run through and I'll make sure that everyone who have filed questions will be given an opportunity to seek clarifications. But before I call on members for clarifications, I wish to point out two standing orders to guide members and to facilitate discussions on the ministerial statements. Firstly, pursuant to Standing Order 23, members may seek clarification on the ministerial statements on Singapore's anti-money laundering regime, but there is no debate that should be allowed thereon. Members can seek clarifications by way of asking questions. So I seek members' understanding to keep your clarifications clear and concise so that ministers can answer as many clarifications as possible. But likewise, I would also ask the ministers to also keep your answers clear and concise. Secondly, pursuant to Standing Order 50, Section 2, reference should not be made to any matter which is sub judice. I'd like to advise members to exercise caution in discussing or reflecting the details of the cases before the courts, as it would be sub judice or prejudice the investigations and interests of the parties to the matters. Okay, I'll ask my clerks to help me spot all the hands, but I will call on Mr. Murali first.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My colleagues in the GPC for Home Affairs and Law and I have been closely scrutinizing this case. We would like to commend the officers of the Singapore Police Force, particularly the Commercial Affairs Department, for detecting this case and successfully executing an extensive operation that led to the seizure of more than Singapore $2.8 billion worth of assets to date. Practitioners in this area often refer to assets from ill-gotten gains as oxygen for the criminals. Seizing and confiscating such high-value assets in one fell swoop is tantamount to depriving criminals of oxygen, thereby decisively crippling their activities. Such steps constitute, in my view, the best deterrence against anti-money laundering activities in Singapore. I invite honourable members in this House to join me to congratulate the police for a job well done. Mr. Speaker, sir, I have a clarification for the Honourable Second Minister for Home Affairs. In her speech, she referred to the FATF as setting the global AML standards and that Singapore, as a member, subscribes to these standards. I understand that the FATF has conducted mutual evaluation of Singapore's AML standards to gauge compliance with its 40 recommendations to tackle illicit financial flows. How have we fared in these mutual evaluations as far as the abilities and the enforcement records of our enforcement agencies are concerned? And how do we compare to the abilities of enforcement agencies at other major financial centers, such as in London or New York?
Second Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd also like to thank members as well as Mr. Murali for their affirmation of the work done by our law enforcement agencies. Sir, I would like to keep my response to Mr. Murali quite brief, but understandably, all the work that goes into our AML regime is quite involved. So with your permission, sir, may I ask the clerks to distribute a handout which describes more fully the different aspects of our anti-money laundering regime?
Okay, please can proceed to give out the handouts.
Thank you, sir. Members may also access the handout through the MP at SGPAL app. Whilst the materials are making their way to members, Mr. Murali in his question referred to FATF and the mutual evaluations that are being conducted by FATF. By way of background, for members' information, Singapore has been a member of FATF since 1992. And FATF, as an international organization that sets standards for the prevention of money laundering, is well recognized for several things. For one thing, the standards that FATF has set are adopted by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. So as far as the IMF and the World Bank are concerned, FATF standards are gold standards. If you are a serious financial center and you meet those standards, then in a sense, you have passed the test. But how does one get evaluated against the standards? So what Mr. Murali referred to are mutual evaluations. And who does the mutual evaluation? These are experts that are drawn from within FATF itself as an organization, as well as a global network of expert practitioners. So individuals like that are held in high regard. What they say carry weight. Now, because this is a very involved exercise to carry out a mutual evaluation, countries don't get to be audited so regularly. We were last audited, last went through this mutual evaluation in 2016. We have joined the queue. The next time we go through the mutual evaluation is in fact 2025. But what was said after the evaluation in 2016? I quote from the FATF report, and it says, Singapore has a strong legal and institutional framework to fight money laundering and terrorist financing. Singapore's AML-CFT coordination is highly sophisticated and inclusive of all relevant competent authority. It says that we are highly sophisticated and inclusive of all relevant competent authority. Mr. Murali's question is, how does it put us in comparison to other jurisdictions? It puts us in good standing when compared to leading jurisdictions like Australia. But because the evaluations are done at different times, it's not possible to treat this as an apple-for-apple comparison. But what we do have, if you refer to the handout, under Annex A, I think there is a Table 1, which provides the ratings that Singapore was awarded in 8 outcome areas that were relevant to money laundering. And we have also, in Table 1, reflected the ratings that were awarded to other leading jurisdictions who were evaluated around the same time as Singapore. So that gives members a sense. Now, it doesn't mean after the evaluation we sit still, we're happy with what we've gotten. In all that 7 years that have since passed, we've made significant progress in enhancing our AML regime. For example, we have strengthened the regime for non-financial sectors. So what I talked about earlier, DNF, BPs, that would fall under one category. We've also enhanced the pursuit of cross-border money laundering offences and confiscation of proceeds of crime by all law enforcement agencies, including through international cooperation. And this ongoing case is an excellent example of our efforts. But apart from what FATF says, I would like to draw members' attention to another index that is known as the Basel Anti-Money Laundering Index. And the latest index was tabulated in 2022. I'm afraid I've not been able to include it in the handout. But there were 128 regions that were ranked. in the Basel AML index, 128. And if you are 128, that's the lowest risk. But lowest risk can also mean that nothing is happening in your region. So you're maybe not a financial center of any scale. So I don't think it's possible for Singapore to aim to be 128. It would mean that we don't really have a financial sector, a financial center, of international import. Singapore was ranked 100 out of 128. So amongst those that are considered to be of lowest risks. This ranking puts us ahead of the US, Switzerland, as well as financial hubs such as Hong Kong and Dubai. So I think the facts do speak for themselves. Thank you.
Following up from where Second Minister for Finance have suggested, I would ask members for this first set of clarifications, if he could center around the area of any clarifications on the anti-money laundering system. Let me repeat. So that's the first segment we try to cover. And then we will move on to the financial system and sector. And then we move on to real estate. And then we move on to companies, immigration, work passes. And finally, the last one is open category. So first area of clarifications, let's try to target it around the anti-money laundering system. Okay, Mr. Raj Thomas.
Thank you, sir. And I thank the ministers for setting out MS's AML and CFT measures. I would like to ask if the ministers could shed some light on how is it that despite what appears to be a very comprehensive set of measures which have been ranked well internationally, that such huge amounts of money were still able to enter into our financial system, and how is it that these monies could also be spent in various types of transactions? And second, related to my earlier question, I would like to ask also whether there was any indication of complicity on the part of our Singapore-regulated banks and or their employees in facilitating transactions carried out by the accused persons. Thank you, sir.
Second Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for his questions. I explained during my statement that when we set up our strategies for prevention of money laundering, we must understand that it's not all about prevention only. We must know from the outset that however stringent the measures we put in place, criminal actors, money launderers will find ways and means to still take advantage of our openness and our solid reputation as a sound financial center. It is precisely because of our openness and precisely because we are deemed to have very high reputation that the money launderers find us just as attractive as the legitimate investors. So we must know that they are resolved. They are determined to try and circumvent the rules that we put in place. Therefore, the strategy must also include detection and enforcement. If we merely had prevention and then imagine that all is well and good, we are kidding no one else but ourselves. And so it's useful for us to remember, if we don't detect any cases at all, and more importantly, if we aren't able to mount a robust response by way of enforcement and taking these criminals to task, it doesn't necessarily speak better of the robustness of our anti-money laundering regime. In this particular instance, we have uncovered a very large web. I don't mean to cast aspersions on other regimes, but the examples that I cited shows you how difficult it is to round up criminals. Some of the amounts that I cited, if we think that that is all there is to the illicit funds that are sloshing around these other regimes, I think that's not being very realistic. So the strength of our regime is also in detection, and then to be able to enforce in a decisive and robust manner. In this particular instance, if we had not made the decision to withhold enforcement action until as full a picture emerged, we might have been able to say sometime in 2022 or earlier part of 2023, gone after the suspects. You might not have gotten what was initially 1.8 billion, which grew to 2.4 and now 2.8 billion dollars. You might have found a much smaller amount, and we might have patted ourselves on the back to say that, well, that was not too bad. Well done. But in fact, we would have missed an opportunity to get to the root of the problem and to try our very best to stamp it out. Now, this ability to uncover a web of this size is actually something that speaks volumes. So if you are a money launderer, if you still think that Singapore is a good place to try and flow your dirty money through, please know that we are equally resolved to catch you.
Ms. Hazel Phua.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to seek two clarifications. The first is the MAS of the view that our existing penalties imposed on financial institutions for breaches of anti-money laundering measures sufficiently deterrent? And are the financial penalties linked to the amount that is being laundered? My second clarification is what sort of penalties have been imposed on the real estate companies or agents for breaching anti-money laundering measures? Thank you.
MOS Alvin Tan.
So I thank the member for a supplementary question. As my colleagues have mentioned, there are three prongs to this, the approach towards anti-money laundering and terrorist financing. And key to this is the first prong, which is prevention, and MAS regularly reviews all of our AML and countering financial terrorism procedures and review them as we go along, and of course regularly as well. The first also is that given that there are huge financial flows to the system, millions of transactions every day, the same qualities which strengths in our financial system will also be exploited by criminals. In this case, and also in speaking to Member Raj Thomas's view, the MAS's supervisory engagements with financial institutions, underpinned by all of the different procedures and regulations and prevention, are ongoing in this case. And we will constantly review whether there had been any lapses in the AML, CFT, in accordance to our process and our policies, and also whether any of these lapses have been occurred in onboarding the accused persons. And where there has been complicity on the part of the relationship manager, for example, or senior management in onboarding accused persons. And I wanted to assure all members that if the MAS finds any complicity or collusion by banks or their staff, we will not hesitate to take firm actions against the financial institutions and individuals involved to hold them accountable.
Mr. Zulkarnain Abdul Rahim.
Thank you, sir. I thank Second Minister for Home Affairs for answering my PQs. I have just one SQ. Although we need strict controls for our AML regime, I think we need to balance that with the cost of due diligence and overburdening our businesses for checks and reporting. So what are the steps to sense make and regularly consult the stakeholders, particularly FIs, pawnbrokers, and our precious stones and metal dealers as well? Thank you.
Second Minister Teo.
Mr. Speaker, I thank Mr. Zulkarnain for his question. May I also just note that Mr. Mark Lee made largely the same comments when he posed his parliamentary question, which was to urge caution in terms of the extent of the measures that we put in place. To Mr. Zul's question, in fact, our sectoral regulators engage with their gatekeepers very regularly. Earlier this year, for example, because of the impending changes in our Precious Stones, Precious Metals Act, the PSPM Act, MinLaw had engaged with the industry, but behind closed doors, to get a sense of what they were observing and to also find out if the additional measures that MinLaw was thinking about, would be too onerous to implement, and also more importantly, to what extent they could be effective. MAS, as well as the Council for Estate Agents, regularly engage their respective communities of gatekeepers as well. So these engagements are ongoing. But I think the point that you are also trying to make, sir, if I may, is the key is in sense-making. It's not just a question of imposing reporting requirements, for the sake of the reporting requirements. We'd have to try and connect the dots. Otherwise, it's just lots of signals and, a lot of noise, which you can't really do very much about. You've heard me talk about how the Suspicious Transactions Reporting Office, STRO, had put in place a new data analytics system since February of last year. And MOS Alvin Tan also talked about using Cosmic as a way of helping financial institutions make better sense of what information has already been captured through the STRs. These efforts will obviously have to intensify. And I should also say that each time we have a big bust like that, it also offers us fresh insights as to what kinds of signals we should be paying greater attention to. Thank you.
Mr. Neil Pera.
The truth is that even the best technology today, it is impossible to completely weed out money laundering. And as the minister put it so eloquently, it's not like looking for one needle in one haystack, but for looking for one needle in multiple haystacks. And we also have to keep in mind that while good guys are getting smarter, perhaps the not so good guys are getting smarter even faster. Having spent many years as the Asia CEO of a large Australian bank, I've lived through this experience myself.
Mr. Perot, can you get to your clarification, please?
Very quickly. So my question is, from most gatekeepers, intermediaries wish to enforce the AML rules on a regular basis, but often are not equipped or knowledgeable enough to ask the right questions during the process. So perhaps the focus should be more on providing additional training and guidance for these intermediaries as well as potential gatekeepers to make sure that the right questions are asked. In many ways, one feels that the non-banking financial institution intermediaries are where banking institutions used to be 15 years ago. Thank you.
Minister Teo.
Mr. Speaker, I fully agree with Mr. Neil Parekh. He's absolutely right. We do have a set of red flag indicators that each sectoral regulator provides to their community of gatekeepers. Clearly, these indicators can be improved, and we will continue to do so over time. Clearly, it is also in our interest to ensure that the training of the gatekeepers are properly done so that they, like Mr. Neil Parekh says, also ask their customers the right questions and their minds are correctly attuned to the potential risks. So I thank him for his suggestions. It's certainly something that we will continue to uplift our capabilities in, and I'm sure Minister Indrani in her interministerial committee will look into. I think it is, in fact, the fourth of your terms of reference, if I heard you correctly. Thank you.
Mr. Leong Man Wai.
Sir, I have two questions, two supplementary questions, one for Minister Josephine and one for Minister Indrani. For Minister Josephine, can I ask, based on the investigation so far, how was the $2.8 billion of funds placed in our system? For example, how much was through our banking system and how much was through cash and then how much to other channels? For Minister Indrani, may I ask, just now she answered the question on the cash transactions. Although she said that it is not appropriate to impose quantum on the amount of cash to be used in transactions, but I used to run a stockbroking company in Singapore, can I declare, and we report suspicious transaction as well. So can I ask Minister Indrani, so far, what was the maximum amount of cash that was reported by the institutions, whether it's financial institutions or whether the integrated resorts or property companies, the highest amount of cash transaction reported by IR, bank, and property companies through the suspicious transactions reporting system? Thank you.
Minister Teo.
Mr. Speaker, I thank Mr. Leong for his questions. But as I explained during my ministerial statement, this is a live investigation. And I have shared with members the extent to which I'm able to reveal. So as to your specific question, this is a level of detail that will have to be made known at a later stage. I'm not able to comment more on the details of this case because Mr. Leong asked how they came to be placed in our financial system. This is a level of detail that we are not at liberty to discuss right now. As you well imagine, we are continuing to uncover new assets. And if we are in the process of still trying to uncover the assets that have been procured as a result of these likely criminal proceeds, it would not be in the interest to say more at this point in time, how the tracks were eventually identified. I'm also not sure that the question that you posed to Minister Indrani ought to be answered by her. I think I should answer it because it relates to the STROs. I had mentioned in my statement that 43,000 STRs were filed on average annually between 2020 and 2022. 80% of them came from the financial institutions. 20% came from the other non-financial institutions, gatekeepers. That would include corporate service providers, that would include property agents, and other types of gatekeepers. So that is the overall number. He might have missed that. Yeah. Oh, I'm not sure there was another level of detail that he was seeking.
Sir, sorry.
Mr. Leong, okay.
Yes. Can I clarify for the minister that I'm asking for specific amount of cash reported by the IR, reported by the banks, and reported by the property companies in the STR system?
So, as much as I'd like to be able to provide this level of detail, I'm afraid this is not possible right now.
Okay.
Minister Indrani, is there anything you'd like to add?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No, there's nothing I would like to add except to say one other thing, which is that the STRs by their nature are confidential. So insofar as anybody's asking what does an STR contain, that is not information that is generally disclosed in any event because it's part of the investigation, and this is a live investigation.
Mr. Mark Lee.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I extend my gratitude to the ministers for their thorough response concerning this case. I have 3 supplementary questions. The first is, considering Singapore's amplified efforts to combat money laundering, will we be maintaining a universally welcoming stance for businesses or transition to a more discerning and selective methodology? Are there plans to recalibrate our focus towards specific countries or demographic sectors? The second, as the government introduced new protocols which are crucial to uphold our reputation as a reliable financial center, these compliance measures would also require capacity development, skill enhancement, and adaptation periods for both frontline and back-end personnel across all participating entities. How are we planning to bolster these capabilities without compromising the system's overall efficiency? Thank you.
Minister Teo.
Mr. Speaker, to Mr. Lee's first question, we will proceed carefully. I think within his question is the concern that we will have knee-jerk reactions and overdo the reporting requirements as well as the other anti-money laundering obligations that we impose on different companies. So his point is very well taken. We always strive to be very calibrated. In the statements of my colleagues and I, we were careful to emphasize that maintaining Singapore's overall friendliness towards legitimate businesses and legitimate investors, that must still be a priority for us to uphold. And it is not a question of just layering on new measures without regard to their effectiveness, but really weighing which are the new approaches or measures that will be necessary in order for us to uphold our reputation as a sound financial center. So that's to his first question. His second question is with regards to capability development and expanding the capacity of both our law enforcement agencies as well as our gatekeepers. It's very much related to Mr. Neil Parek's points, and we totally agree with him. And that is also an area of effort that we will have to step up. I'm sorry, I wasn't sure there was a third question specifically. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Saktiandi Supa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have one SQ. I would like to direct it to Minister Indrani and MOS Alvin. I sort of listened to Minister Josephine's speech just now. She mentioned about the financial sector contributing about 14% to GDP and 200,000 workers. So I'm mindful of the importance that the financial sector contributes to Singapore's GDP, and of course the entrepot hub, trade hub as well. So I just want to ask an SQ on the enhancement aspects of things following this issue. First question I have for MOS Alvin is with regards to resources to MOS in terms of how much we have spent on handling AML in MAS to handle such things, including in terms of staffing, in terms of capacity building. So in somewhat way related to the previous SQs, staffing resources. And the additional question is to Minister Indrani. In the Inter-Ministerial Committee, in terms of capacity building for agencies in relation to the financial sector like MAS, how do we compare in terms of staffing and amounts spent on capacity building comparing to other financial hubs like New York, London, and of course Hong Kong and other jurisdictions as well? Do we fare in comparison in terms of spending, in terms of staffing levels going forward as well? Thank you.
MOS Tan.
So I thank Mr. Saktiandi Supat for his questions, and I acknowledge also that it's very important that the financial sector represents 14% and accounts for 200,000 jobs. So we must make sure that our financial sector remains robust, both in terms of the vibrancy of the financial sector, as well as being stringent and to prevent illicit activities in the financial sector. In that case, in the second limb of that question, therefore, it is how are we preparing our sector regulators, supervisors, for example, to be prepared and to be able to look out for these illicit activities. Let me share a few. On anti-money laundering resources, the MAS's approach to the supervision of anti-money laundering and the countering of financial terrorism, it has established a dedicated department. That's the AMLD in 2016. And this department is responsible for three aspects, include reviewing policies regularly relating to money laundering and illicit financing, and also to then supervise how financial institutions manage these risks. The third is also being forward-looking and constantly looking at trends and typologies that will emerge, such as the typologies that have emerged in this case. But we also know that there is some limitations. The AMLD currently has 40 staff and then works very closely with other departments to tackle AML as well as CFT. But we also understand that the volume, Minister Josephine Teo talks about 43,000 over 2020 to 2022, and 80% of these STRs are filed by financial institutions. I wanted to assure the member and also members of this House that, in fact, MAS has been building up these capabilities and at present are using data analytics and network analysis tools to conduct system-wide money laundering and terrorist financing risk surveillance. It's really our approach to continue to review and enhance these surveillance capabilities, including with the money laundering and terrorist financing information when we launch and we roll out COSMIC, which allow greater sharing of information amongst financial institutions. We will also share information with RTIG and other agencies, inter-ministry agencies, to act on the typologies that I mentioned that are emerging and quickly stop these illicit activities from gaining ground. Thank you.
Minister Indrani.
Mr. Speaker, sir, Mr. Saktiandi asked how do we compare with other hubs in terms of, I think, the spending that we put in for the resources. If I may, that may not be perhaps the way to look at how to strengthen effectiveness, because it's not so much how much money you put into it, but how effective you are and how much value you get for whatever money you put into it. So if you just take a broader look at the system, if you think about it this way, there are so many parts to our system. It's not just who is staffing the STRO or who's staffing police or who's staffing a particular ministry. Every bank officer who deals with people is a part of the system. Every real estate agent is a part of the system. Every lawyer, every accountant, every registered filing agent. So, and each of them have parts of the puzzle. And the real nature or the real key to uncovering money laundering is actually making sense of the patterns, because everybody owns a little piece of it. You file, you send it to STRO, and I think Minister Josephine mentioned earlier, STRO is doing much more of the data analytics now. So increasingly, it's going to become technology and analytics that pulls together all the information that different people in the system submit up. So I think to answer his question, when we set up the Interministerial Committee, one of the key areas of focus that I talked about was how we can centralize and strengthen monitoring and sense-making capabilities across government agencies to better detect suspicious activities. So we will put in whatever resources are necessary to be able to make better sense of this. And some of it will have to be done by technology, Some of it has to be done through better training, of whether it's real estate agents or anybody else, and the financial sector. And then the real key is how do you design it in a way that it pulls together all this information and a pattern emerges. That's really how the detection and the capability building should be built up.
Ms. Hertingru?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have three clarifications. The first is a general one. In recent years, we have seen increased wealth influx into Singapore, and some of these funds flows are now suspected to be part of the proceeds of criminal activities. So I'm just wondering, taken in total, what implications or estimated effects will these developments and findings have on our economy, specifically financial, wealth management, asset management sectors going forward? So that's the first clarification. The second one is, for Minister Indrani, relating to the approvals granted to foreigners to buy landed properties in Singapore. And I think it's well taken that the numbers have been very low. But I think just coming back to my PQ, I was just wondering, about whether SLA actually specifically looks at money laundering, does kind of some money laundering checks as well when doing the assessments for these applications. And, I think one of the criteria was also about exceptional economic contributions should be made to Singapore. And I'm just wondering about, what sort of general factors are taken into account when making the assessment of whether or not these applications do meet this criteria. And I think my third clarification is how many property agents, developers and owners have been investigated in the last 3 years for failing to exercise duties to conduct CDD AML type checks? And how are these investigations typically commenced? Are they usually tip-offs or are they proactive investigations that are carried out to make sure that all these individuals and these professions are actually exercising their duties properly? Thank you.
MOS Alvin Tan.
So I'll answer Ms. Hertingru's first question. I think the flow of funds speak to the robustness and the dynamism of Singapore's financial sector. As we mentioned earlier on, it accounts for 14% of our GDP as well as 200,000 jobs. So we must and we will continue to build our financial sector because it creates good jobs for Singaporeans and enhances our standing as an international financial center. However, we know, given that there are millions of transactions every single day, that there will be some illicit funds, but the majority of these transactions, as we had mentioned, are legitimate. So it's very important that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, we throw only the dirty water out. That's really important. The second part of this limb, as I had mentioned earlier on, is also the robustness of our money laundering and AML and CFT regulations. That's really much in line with what international financial sectors have. So it's strict enough, but we are also very keen to make sure that we remain, as both Mr. Mark Lee as well as Mr. Neil Parekh had mentioned, we remain open to global financial flows, investments, as well as talent. Thank you.
Minister Indrani, I actually wanted to request Ms. He whether she would mind if your questions on real estate, if we could move it when we cover the third segment. I can see that we're starting. I know it's sometimes not easy to frame it all together, but I can see that we're moving from segment 1 to second segment, which is on financial system and sector. So I will try to frame it in that way so that all the questions, if possible. And I will come back to you, Ms. He, when we come back to the real estate. Mr. Derek Goh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Alluding to MOS's earlier point about strengthening of MAS's capabilities and AMLD in respect of AML, could MOS share his perspective on how other international financial centers have dealt with financial institutions as well as complicit individuals who are implicated in money laundering cases? And then, of course, comparing this to Singapore's situation. Thank you.
MOS Tan.
So I thank Mr. Derek Goh for his supplementary questions. I think both Ministers Teo and Minister Indrani had also mentioned this, and I thought it would be useful to also flesh this out. Minister Teo mentioned, and I too have mentioned, that the very characteristics that make us a dynamic and open financial sector also makes it attractive to criminals. But like Singapore, we are not, like other financial sectors, Singapore is not unique to this challenge of money laundering. Other financial regulators have also had to deal with the cases, and Minister Teo had mentioned that in her main reply. For instance, we mentioned the 1MDB case, but the US, the UK, Switzerland, and Hong Kong also impose fines and warnings against their financial institutions for respective failures in AML CFT controls. In Switzerland, for example, one individual was fined for failing to file STR. So it's not unique to Singapore, it's unique across the world's financial centers. I would like to assure the member and members of this House that Singapore will continue to fiercely defend Singapore's reputation as a clean and trusted financial center, and to make sure and to assure everybody that we will not hesitate to take firm actions where warranted, including taking financial institutions and individuals to task should we find evidence for breaches of law and misconduct.
Mr. Donwy.
Thank you, Speaker. I have two SQs for MOS Alvin. Does MAS have any roadmap to expand the cosmic financial crime risk to new or known trends that may pose a reputation risk? And how does MAS decide to disseminate such intelligence deriving from STRs in a timely manner to other FIs as part of the ACIP, public-private partnership, that have proven to be effective, especially when it is not uncommon that such ML suspects hop banks after their accounts were closed by their previous bankers? Thanks.
MOS Tan.
So I thank Mr. Don Wee for this very important question. I think it's quite important just to understand whether if you open a bank account and you're affected, whether you can hop to another bank and whether that information will be shared. As the member knows, MAS requires banks to abide by customer confidentiality provisions that's provided for in the Banking Act. And this prohibits them from disclosing customer information. However, to prevent criminals from exploiting these weaknesses, that each financial institution's understanding of their customers' risk profile is because that's limited by the information the financial institution collects. We know that that is a particular weakness. And therefore, as I mentioned earlier on, we are developing COSMIC to allow financial institutions to share information on customers that specifically cross certain risk thresholds, and to then allow them to break down these information silos more effectively so that you're able to detect and disrupt criminal activities. In subsequent phases, as mentioned earlier, we will expand COSMIC to include other risk areas and even more financial institutions. But in the interim, as we await the launch of COSMIC, MAS will monitor for material risk mitigation to financial institutions not yet on COSMIC. And then we will also take the preventive or supervisory measures to prevent or to mitigate such developments from taking place. In the meantime also, banks can and should and will be and are able to alert other financial institutions of concerning trends, typologies, and emerging risks through sharing information on our public-private platform, which Mr. Donry mentioned, which is ACIP, so that mitigating factors and mitigating actions can be taken by financial institutions as well as government agencies to thwart these efforts.
Ms. Usha Chandradas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have two clarifications for the Minister of State, Mr. Alvin Tan. I thank him, first of all, for addressing my parliamentary question relating to the tax-related financial sector incentives. Now, the Minister of State has mentioned that one accused person involved in the money laundering incident has been linked to a tax-incentivized single-family office. But upon application for that tax incentive, nothing suspicious had surfaced. So I would like to clarify if the entity concerned is still enjoying the tax incentive that it has been granted, and if so, whether there are any plans underway to revoke the grant of that tax incentive. Now, I would also like to clarify that my original parliamentary question related to the general grant of incentives to funds under sections 13D, 13O, and 13U of the Income Tax Act, and so not just to incentives granted to single-family offices. So can the Minister of State confirm that within this wider scope of the question, that it is still the case that only one accused person has been linked to a tax-incentivized entity? Thank you.
MOS Tan.
I thank the member for a question. As investigations are ongoing, I cannot reveal more than I had said in my parliamentary reply earlier on. However, what I can say is that MAS is tightening these measures as necessary, and we will be looking to terminate these incentives as appropriate.
Mr. Edward Chia.
Thank you, Speaker. I would like to thank ministers for addressing my PQ on potential abuse on charities' fundraising platforms. I would like to ask three clarifications. The first is, in the cases where charities are found to be receiving donations by individuals that have been found guilty of money laundering, what are the recourse for charities if they spent the said sums to serve the charity's beneficiaries, and if there will be any difference in recourse between charities who have filed STR compared to those who have not? A second clarification is, what are the duties of charity fundraising platforms, not just the charities, but the platforms, in protecting themselves against money laundering or TF abuse? And thirdly, are there enhancements to the COC's controls and abilities to detect malicious actors from using charities for round-tripping purposes? Thank you.
MOS Tan.
Sir, excuse me. Sir, I thank the member for his SQ with this is regards to charities. I think your first question, the answer to the first question is, in fact, it is a legal obligation to file an STR if charities know or in fact have grounds to suspect that the property or transaction that they are dealing with is connected to criminal activity. We'll be covering these questions in the COC's advisory, which Minister Josephine Teo had mentioned. On your second question, that's on the duties of charities, on how to safeguard against money laundering and terrorist financing abuse. We expect charities to implement appropriate mitigating measures to safeguard themselves against potential abuse for illicit purposes, including money laundering and terrorist financing, as charities may be misused as conduits for the movement of illegal funds. Now, charities should exercise vigilance in accepting donations, in particular when the donors are unknown or unfamiliar to the charities, or when requests are made by donors to redirect part of the donations to unknown third parties for purposes that may be incongruent with the charity's charitable objectives. Charities should also perform reasonable due diligence checks on donors so as to ascertain the legitimacy of the source of funds or donations received, especially when a substantial amount of donation is received from an unfamiliar or an unknown donor. Now, if charities have reasonable grounds to suspect that any property may be connected to a criminal activity, as I mentioned earlier on, they are required to file an STR. On question 3, we will review if there are gaps found. And the Commission of Charities have been engaging charities all of this while on AML and CFT measures, and we will continue these efforts.
Ms. Fumiha.
Thank you, Speaker. I have one clarification for Minister Indrani. We can only be as strong as our weakest link. In many jurisdictions, designated non-financial businesses and professions, DNFBPs in short, such as lawyers, accountants, and real estate agents, are regulated in as much the same way as credit and financial institutions. Actually, the report that Minister Josephine quoted, the same report, FATF's report, actually went on to say, in Singapore, whilst it had good things to say, but it did go on to say that Singapore, and highlighted that Singapore's immature understanding of money laundering and terrorist financing risk amongst these players, the DNF BPs. So I would like to ask the Minister her assessment of what the state of development in Singapore amongst the non-financial sector in combating money laundering, and what more can we do to strengthen our system. I think most importantly, I think when we get to the ministerial committee, is to look at aligning of incentives. Thank you.
Minister Indrani.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I thank Ms. Fumiha for clarification. I think when people look at the very large, staggering quantum of the 2.8 billion in this case, they might draw the wrong conclusion about the state of money laundering in Singapore or the adequacy of our regulatory regime. But this really couldn't be further from the reality, because this case is a culmination of 2 years of painstaking planning. So you were asking about, my assessment of where we stand now. Well, I would say that first and foremost, it's a strong and a robust regime. We could, for example, have just at the beginning just taken out a few of the suspects, seize a few $1 million, call it a day, but we didn't do that. We wanted to develop a full as picture as possible, go after the entire network. So we take a holistic approach. Where there were suspicious indicators associated with any individual, we pursued it relentlessly. We were patient. And this is testament to the strength and robustness of our regulatory and enforcement regime. But we can always do better. And I think that what we have been outlining here today is we have been saying that we can do better in regulating gatekeepers like the lawyers, accountants, real estate agents, especially through prevention, detection, and enforcement, as well as other prongs of our anti-money laundering strategy. And that is what the IMC, or the Interministerial Committee, will be looking at.
I'm starting to go into the real estate segment 3, but okay, it looks like the... Okay, Mr. Gerald Giam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think my PQ 4976 in the order book was not fully answered. I'll just repeat the salient points of it. I asked in each of the last 3 years how many STRs were filed with regard to property transactions, and how many of such property transactions were later found to be involved in MLTF activities. And lastly, how many individuals were prosecuted for a failure to file STRs when they should have. And I have some further clarifications for Second Minister Indrani. So, real estate formed a large proportion of the $2.8 billion in assets seized in the operations. However, property agents tell me they often don't have many tools other than a Google search engine to conduct customer due diligence. Can property agents access detailed background information on foreign individuals, including their businesses, wealth sources, and red flags from the 43,000 suspicious transaction reports? If not, can MAS grant them limited access to Cosmic, RTIG, or another similar portal for better due diligence? And I note that Second Minister said that the CAA is developing a one-stop web page. What will this web page provide, and when will it be ready? Thank you.
Minister Indrani. And perhaps you could also address what Ms. He Ting Ru raised just now on real estate.
Okay, perhaps I will take that one first, the question by Ms. He Ting Ru. I think Ms. He asked, firstly, whether or not SLA carries out CDD. The answer is SLA doesn't carry out additional anti-money laundering checks on transactions because this would duplicate the existing customer due diligence checks by real estate agents, developers, and agencies. The conveyancing lawyers and the financial institutions also do the checks. So SLA is not the main interface with the people doing the purchases, and hence they don't do AML checks. I think her second question was on the contributions for approvals. As I mentioned earlier in my main answer, when it comes to landed property, there are two approval regimes. One is for mainland Singapore, and then the other is for land that was residential property that was developed specifically to market to international clientele. And there's one, Sentosa Cove. So it is the mainland Singapore one where the approval regime is much, much stricter. And that is, I mentioned earlier, for that's the one where we take into account various things. The applicant must be PR for at least 5 years, and that's the one that requires the exceptional economic contribution to Singapore. And that could include factors like, how much income tax has been paid, what other contributions they have made. But for the Sentosa Cove one, which was developed specifically for an international clientele, generally speaking, the person would basically have to, let me just see, indicated that earlier. Generally, if they are able to show identity, that they own one landed, they're not allowed to own more than one landed property, so they shouldn't have any other residential property, approval is generally granted. And in my earlier answer, I said out of the 88 applications, only two were denied. So that's on the approvals. And then finally, I think Ms. He had a question on how many estate agents had action taken against them. She had asked in respect of the past 5 years, but actually the Act and the regulations have been since 3 years, is that right? The Act and regulations have been in place since 21, so that's the period you're referring to. Well, the short answer is that CA will not hesitate to take action against property agents or agencies who are found to have breached the Estate Agents Act or the PML-FT regulations, and those who fail to comply with the regulations can face disciplinary action, including financial penalties of up to 100,000 for property agents and 200,000 for property agencies, and suspension of or revocation of an agent's registration or an agency's license. So since 2021, CEA has taken action against 2 property agents who were found guilty of the CEA Disciplinary Committee for contraventions of the EAA and the PML-FT regulations. These agents failed to comply with regulations relating to obtaining, documenting, and verifying the accuracy of identifying information of clients, and determining and documenting the risk assessment of clients engaging in money laundering or financing of terrorism. In the most recent case, the property agent was imposed with a financial penalty of 400,000 and had her registration suspended for 4 months in July 2023. So basically fines, and you can be suspended and have your license revoked. I think Mr. Gerald Giam had asked about information sharing. With respect to Cosmic, that will have to be directed to Moss Alvin Tan. But with respect to how we can better assist real estate agents, as I mentioned, CA is looking at setting up the webpage to assist them. We will step up on the training and on the guidelines. Some other types of information they would have available to them by way of ACRA searches, for example. This is information that they can pull. And for higher risk transactions, they're actually required to do enhanced due diligence. So they actually have to ask for information. So if they're being represented by someone and the beneficial owner or the owner is not here, you would want to see, for example, a power of attorney, letter of authorization. You might then have to ask for sources of the income, the company's place of incorporation. I mean, the types of documentation differ, but essentially, CA conducts these guidelines and trainings for the real estate agents so that they will have a better idea of what to ask. And as part of the interministerial committee that I will be chairing, we will look to see what more we can do to better equip real estate agents in this sector.
Associate Professor Jim Muslim.
Thank you, Speaker. If indeed property seems like it is one of the more major vehicles for loopholes, potential loopholes in the money laundering process, I'm wondering, at least for the interministerial committee, will there be a disproportionate effort in better aligning AML procedures for the real estate sector vis-a-vis other financial institutions? I say this because many industry insiders share with us that they believe that there's at least a 10 to 15-year lag in terms of the quality of AML regulations in the sector vis-a-vis the financial sector more generally.
Minister Indrani.
I thank the member for his clarification, and indeed we agree that more can be done. We have already started to do more in this space, which is why even before this case came about, we had already started to look at how we could strengthen the system. Hence, the Real Estate Agents Act was passed. I think passed in 2010, came into effect in 2021, and the regulations that I mentioned as well. And we will certainly see what we can do to strengthen the regulations in this sector.
Mr. Desmond Chu.
I have a clarification for the Minister of State, Mr. Alvin Tan, on the role of family office in this case. How many family officers are involved, and how would MAS strengthen the regulatory regime for family officers?
MOS Tan.
So I mentioned to Ms. Usha as well as Mr. Desmond Chu, maybe I'll share a little bit again. I said that ongoing investigations and supervisory engagement suggest that one or more of the accused persons in this case may have been linked to SFOs that were awarded tax incentives. I also earlier shared with Ms. Usha that MAS is looking to tighten these checks and that we will be looking to terminate these incentives as appropriate. But I also wanted to take a step back to also touch on Ms. Hertingru's point about financial flows. And family offices play an important role in our financial sector as well. And I want to caution members against seeing all SFOs in the same light as those that are charged or wanted. SFOs linked to this case, in fact, represent a very small proportion of all the SFOs here. We have just completed the consultation, which will enable us to tighten some of these processes, but we remain open, as myself and the other ministers had mentioned, to talent, to investments, as well as to financial flows, including those in SFOs. But our regime is strict, our regime is in line with international best practices, and so these two prongs of making sure that we are dynamic and open and that we also have strong, robust controls remain central to our functioning as a vibrant and trusted financial center.
Mr. Yip Hong Wing.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is directed to Minister Indrani. I'm glad to hear that there are several levels of checks for real estate transactions to prevent money laundering. Are the current checks sufficient, and how do we ensure compliance for these checks? For instance, how do we ensure that our property agents are trained to the appropriate level to conduct AML CDD? perhaps maybe having some audit checks and also have them take some compliance tests. And also, given this case, will there be further measures to ensure that Singapore's property market is not being targeted or misused for money laundering activities beyond just filing suspicious transactions reports? Thank you.
Minister Indrani.
So, I think we can always do more to help equip real estate agents and others in the sector to do better. But I think that the key thing to remember is this. The obligation that they have is to file a suspicious transaction report. So long as something strikes them as suspicious, that is their main duty. They don't have to carry out an entire investigation and crack the case themselves. They don't have to do the job of CAD or SPF. The key thing that the real estate agents and others in the non-financial sector have to do is to spot when something seems off, something is inconsistent, something cannot be explained. And usually when you're in the sector long enough, you get a sense and a feel of this, which is why these are the gatekeepers. They're the gatekeepers because they are the ones who deal with these transactions constantly. And after a while, you'll be able to pick up when something is just not quite, the way it ought to be. So, in response, I think to the first question, the answer is there's always more that can be done, and we will look at that as part of the Interministerial Committee. I think the other question that Mr. Yip asked was what checks are in place to ensure that Singapore's property market is not being targeted or misused for money laundering activities. You can never ensure that we won't be targeted. You can never ensure 100% that it will never happen, because as much as we try to prevent, you can be sure of the fact that because of our status as a financial hub and a financial center, they would want to come here. But you can make it a very inhospitable place, and you can step up on prevention, detection, and enforcement, which Minister Josephine Teo talked about. The other thing which may not have registered on members' consciousness is this. Minister Josephine Teo alluded to it. You see, the monies that are being laundered, online gambling, other things, most of that took place outside of Singapore. When they want to come here and use Singapore as a base for money laundering, most of them would try to keep the activities here clean. So on the face of it, they would do their very best to be as legitimate as possible here, because they want this to be, the place where you flow the illicit money and it comes out clean, right? Anybody who has watched Breaking Bad will know how this is done, or Better Call Saul. That's, an exposition on how you do money laundering. So, in response to Mr. Yip's question, when they come here, they're going to do their very best to look and feel and seem legitimate. And the illicit monies come from elsewhere, and then they would try to put it through legitimate transactions so that when it comes out, it's clean. I think I have addressed his questions. If I have missed anything, perhaps Mr. Yip should let me know.
I did see Better Call Saul, and it's a good movie. Mr. Louis Chua.
Thank you, Speaker. Just one clarification to Minister Indrani. I think it's in relation to the purchase of landed properties in Sentosa by foreigners. If I recall correctly, I think Minister mentioned that there were 88 transactions, of which 2 were not approved, and that I think just now Minister also responded in response to Ms. Her that the SLA doesn't conduct commercial due diligence. So in this aspect, I just wanted to understand what are the processes or checks that are in place by the SLA when it comes to such approvals, and what were the circumstances behind the two that were not being approved, and given the context of what has happened in the last 2 months, whether or not there are plans to institute additional processes to make sure that there's an additional layer of defense on top of the work that the CEA and agents are doing. Thank you.
Minister Indrani.
For the properties in Sentosa Cove, the foreigners who are non-PRs can acquire them and approvals are generally granted. So if, for example, they own other, if you own one Sentosa Cove property and you want to get another one, then because it's 2 properties, you may not get approval for that unless there's some good reason for it. So the short answer is that the approvals are generally granted. I don't have the details of the 2 that were rejected, but I think the key message that I wanted to get across is that Sentosa Cove was developed for a specific, with a specific marketing clientele in mind, which was international clientele, which is the reason why approval is generally granted when they're purchased by foreigners.
Mr. Gerald Giam.
Sir, could I just request the Second Minister again to answer my question about how many STRs were filed with regard to property transactions?
I don't have the exact number, but it is a much smaller proportion compared to the others. I think Minister Josephine alluded to about 80% of the STRs coming from the financial sector. So for the real estate sector, it's a much smaller proportion. However, what I would like to emphasize is that the real estate agents are operating as part of an entire ecosystem, meaning that for any transaction with a property, there should be a bank involved, usually, a financial institution. There should be a lawyer involved somewhere, the real estate agent or the property developer. So, because it's part of an ecosystem, just because a real estate agent may not have filed an STR, may not in and of itself mean that the transaction will not be, anything suspicious may not be picked up. You have to see it in that broader picture. But the percentage compared to the others is much lower.
I will be slowly moving on to the 4th segment concerning companies, immigration and work passes, just to let everyone know. Mr. Leong Man Wai.
Sir, thanks. I have 3 questions for Minister Indrani. First question, how did the 10 offenders and their associates manage to buy so many properties, over 100 properties bought by them? So how many of the associates are also involved? And while it is reported, second question, while it is reported that there are more than 120 properties involved, identified with the syndicate, why are there only 94 prohibition orders issued on the properties? Third question, are there any landed properties on the mainland Singapore among the not prohibited properties?
Minister Indrani.
Mr. Speaker, sir, let me take the second question first, because he said that when there are more than 120 properties, why are there 94 prohibition orders? Let me go back to what I had said earlier in my ministerial statement. I said to date, 94 residential properties have been issued with prohibition orders. So 94 refers to the residential properties. Then in addition to that, there are 53 commercial properties and 5 industrial properties. So I think that will make up the numbers that Mr. Leong was asking about. Then his other question was there any property on the mainland that was issued with a prohibition order? Was that the question? The answer is no. I said that out of the 94 residential properties, 60 were completed resale units, 34 were uncompleted units, and 8 of these properties were landed residential properties at Sentosa Cove. So there were no mainland landed residential properties purchased. I think the newspaper reports had indicated that some of them were caught in GCBs, or I think that may be what he's thinking about. My understanding is that those were rented properties, not purchased properties. And then finally, I think he'd asked how did the 10, he said 10 offenders, technically they are suspects at this stage. I don't think we can say they're offenders yet. They may well be, but suspects at this stage. I don't have details of that. It's still under investigation. Those details will have to come out later when the investigations are complete.
Mr. Desmond Chu.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask a clarification of Minister Josephine Teo, or perhaps better addressed by Minister Tan See Leng. She shared in her speech that there are frameworks to access work pass applications. Quite a few of the suspects were clearly holding on to work passes, and they were staying in very expensive places. So I'd like to clarify with the Minister for Manpower, what are these checks that MOM does, and how do these checks contribute to the overall anti-money laundering effort? And furthermore, how does MOM intend to improve the way these checks are conducted in light of the money laundering incident to support the whole government effort? Especially, the third one would be that if there were instances of these cases whereby the suspects were staying in places that were very expensive, were these surfaced, and how were these addressed? Thank you.
Minister Dr. Tan See Leng.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Honourable Member for raising questions on the role that MOM has in tackling anti-money laundering risks. The Ministry of Manpower's Work Pass framework is intended to support Singapore in its economic growth. It enables companies to bring in foreigners who are complementary to our local workforce, spurring new investments, new growth in areas like the digital economy and also the green economy. This will help us to transform our economy and also to help us to seize new opportunities, even amidst the uncertain global economic environment and geopolitical challenges in the medium term. And we hope that this will ultimately create more good jobs for Singaporeans. MOM conducts checks to ensure that our work pass framework is not circumvented. In particular, we check whether there's false declaration of salaries and qualifications, and whether companies have business operations to cover the declared salaries of these workers. Now, as in the multiple ministerial statements made by my colleagues earlier, some individuals may abuse the work pass framework to enter Singapore to commit illicit activities, such as the present case of money laundering. Some may pretend to be employed by companies that are actually inactive or dormant. But others may operate companies with an active trading front to mask the movement of their ill-gotten gains. And yet others still may own a portfolio of legitimate and illicit businesses. Criminals will constantly find new ways to circumvent our laws and our regulations and update their methods over time, making the tasks of detection even more complex and more difficult. MOM's salary fraud checks should be therefore seen as the first layer of checks to detect companies that do not have business operations to cover the declared salaries of workers. This first layer of checks is part of a larger whole-of-government system of checks to safeguard against money laundering risks. And we will need to continue to coordinate the rest of government to uncover increasingly complex money laundering operations. Now let me explain in greater detail how MOM conducts salary fraud checks and our role in the whole of government's efforts to manage money laundering risks. First, on the fraud checks, MOM uses data analytics to identify higher risk work pass applications for greater scrutiny. Where there's any sign of possible salary fraud, companies are required to show documentary proof of business operations and their abilities to pay salaries. We may also carry out checks after the work passes have been issued. Companies may be subject to further audits or asked for further proof after the work pass holder arrives in Singapore or subsequently at the point of renewal. MOM also responds to whistleblower reports to investigate whether companies have ongoing business operations. We continuously sharpen our checks to better identify such fraudulent applications. For instance, we regularly update our data analytics with concluded fraud cases and enforcement findings so that they can more accurately pinpoint and flag out applications that are potentially fraudulent. We conduct audits to detect breaches and also to validate and strengthen our analytics. Our enforcement teams are also trained to detect various forms of fraud, salary fraud. Now, specific to the recent money laundering incident, the employment pass applications were approved to these individuals because they met the then prevailing work pass requirements on salary and qualifications. When asked for the proof of business operations and the ability to pay salaries, the companies which submitted the applications were able to provide supporting documents. In addition, as Minister Josephine Teo explained in her ministerial statement earlier, work pass applicants are screened against a database of blacklisted individuals. At the time of their employment pass applications, none of the persons of interest had interposed raid notices issued against them. MOM will continue to sharpen our fraud checks based on real cases on the ground. Learning from the profile of companies, profiles of individuals involved in the money laundering incident, we will update our data analytics with high-risk archetypes and strengthen our checks on whether businesses are operational. However, I hope that all of us members in this House appreciate, and I want to emphasize, that the majority of work pass holders come to Singapore to work and contribute to our economy. Only a small minority are unscrupulous individuals. We therefore must take a sensible approach to calibrating our checks so that we do not hurt bona fide employers. Second, on MOM's role in the whole of government's efforts to manage money laundering risks, and Mr. Desmond Chu's question on how we will improve checks to better do so. Across the government, we will review how to tighten our verification checks at various points. Minister Indrani shared in her speech that she will be leading an interministerial committee to ensure that our regime remains up to date with increasingly sophisticated crimes. MOM will be part of the committee and will support its efforts. With better sharing of information across agencies, MOM can improve our salary fraud checks and share salary fraud cases with other agencies to conduct further probes on whether the relevant individuals are also involved in illicit activities. MOM will continue to take enforcement action on work pass applicants, pass holders, and companies who have been found to be involved in illicit activities. Our work pass framework is part of a broader system that is working as a whole to prevent unscrupulous individuals from entering Singapore on the pretext of employment, though we can and we will review how to tighten our checks at various points. However, we will need to take a balanced approach in reviewing our checks. In the second quarter of 2023, Singapore is ranked the world's best business environment by the Economist Intelligence Unit. This strong performance is in line with many other global rankings on economic competitiveness. Singapore is known to companies as a welcoming place to do business in, and access to both local and global talent is an important factor that they consider. This is a hard-earned reputation that has taken us years to achieve. And as I've said earlier, the vast majority of work pass holders come to Singapore to work and to contribute to our economy. We should not let a handful of individuals or black sheep taint the economic contributions of the majority and start closing our doors or giving the impression that we are doing so. In fact, this is exactly why we need to be targeted in strengthening our checks so that we can take action on unscrupulous individuals and on companies while maintaining a business-friendly environment for the vast majority that want to invest in Singapore and to create good jobs for Singaporeans. Thank you.
Mr. Leong Eng Hua.
Thank you, sir. My question actually is related to what Minister Tan just talked about, the heartland status as a global hub. There's a recent article in the Financial Times that alluded to this phenomenon that companies are increasingly wanting to domicile or headquarter their businesses in Singapore, as they see Singapore as a trusted and neutral jurisdiction where they can avoid the geopolitical sensitivity. And the newspaper, Financial FT, termed this as Singapore washing. So I would like to ask whether it's the MOS or Minister Tan, what's the government's take on this being tagged as a place where, for Singapore washing? More importantly, how do we guard against companies with such intentions who could abuse their legal status as a Singapore domiciled companies to misrepresent themselves in other markets, for example, and which could do harm to our reputation or compromise on our position? Thank you.
MOS Tan.
So I thank Mr. Leong Eng Hua for his question. I think that we have reiterated these points throughout this afternoon, and the points remain very clear. First, our success as an international and financial hub is premised on our status as a trusted and well-governed hub with a strong rule of law. And the same characteristics which investors as well as companies consider when they invest in Singapore, the same characteristics, interconnectedness that illicit criminals and syndicates also are attracted to. And we've also said that Singapore has a very robust AML-CFT regime that is in line with FATF standards, for example, and our regime compares well with other countries. So the core response to the question is that Singapore will always remain attractive. We hope that Singapore will continue to remain attractive, but we must, and we always must, make sure that our AML-CFT standards are in place and prevention, detection, and enforcement are in place at the same time to keep Singapore as open and connected and attractive to the flow of funds, to the flow of talent, and to the flow of businesses. Thank you.
Minister Tan See Leng.
I thank the member for that question. I thought that you get the MES MTI's perspective, and perhaps I can share with you a little bit from the MOM's perspective. From the data analytics, from the triangulation, the working with the various sector agencies, we will continue to drive and improve on our data analytics. The nature of artificial intelligence and data analytics is dependent on past cases that you can actually learn from. And that's the learning model. But it's important to note that as a result of this particular incident, my sense is that it strengthened us as a global hub. And like what Minister Josephine Teo talked about, zero tolerance does not mean zero occurrence. But the very fact that when this was surfaced, it took a whole of government approach, carefully coordinated, very targeted, to eventually catch such a big web. The number of individuals involved, I think, is a very strong signal to the world that we continue to welcome global talent, we continue to welcome top-notch enterprises to come, to set up, to do your business honestly, earnestly, and diligently. I hope that that sort of reassures the member. Thank you.
Minister Teo.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I thought I would just like to briefly respond to the point that was raised by member Mr. Liang. For anyone to see value in being Singapore washed, you must have something within Singapore that has attracted this way of thinking. You must be thought of as a jurisdiction of repute. Your anti-money laundering regime must be held in high regard, because if it weren't, why would it be useful to be Singapore washed? Having said that, it doesn't mean that we adopt a very lax attitude towards anyone who sees a benefit of Singapore washing. In fact, the more this is valuable to the bad actors, to the money launderers, the more we must be resolved to weed them out in order to uphold this standing. So on the one hand, it's kind of worrying that money launderers, criminal actors would want to think of using Singapore as a haven to create the impression of legitimacy. But on the other hand, it must say something about the quality of our regime too. There are no two ways about it. Either we opt out of it and say that this is all too high risk, we don't want to be in this field, we'd rather stay out of it completely, or we say that we take the risks that come with it, we strengthen not just our preventive measures, but also our ability to detect and to take the criminals to task. The enforcement aspect of it, our capabilities, and our consistency in approaching all of these issues as they come about. I think we have to look at it overall in terms of the benefits and the cost. And overall, if we consider how it has enabled Singapore businesses to do to be held in very high regard wherever it is that they go in the world. And if we also think about the benefits it brings to Singaporeans in terms of the quality of jobs that we are able to provide, I think it is really incumbent upon us to make sure that our regime remains robust. And that's what this whole exercise is about for setting up the Interministerial Committee.
Mr. Leong Man Wai.
Sir, I have two questions for MOS Alvin Tan, arising from some of his answers to the SQs. I'd like to seek further clarifications. One, Minister Josephine mentioned that $3.8 million of fines have been imposed on 3 banks. I take it that those are the only fines imposed so far. Is this penalty, the question I want to ask the MOS is this penalty proportional to the amount of profit that the banks can make on the $1.45 billion which is still in the bank accounts? Second question, with regards to the introduction of the cosmic system, why should there be a problem with client confidentiality with regards to the introduction of the cosmic system when the banks already share clients' data, credit data, on the credit bureau? Thank you.
MOS Tan.
So I thank Mr. Leong for his questions. I think the first one is related to the Wirecard only at $3.8 million. Maybe I also provide some background. In the last 5 years, we had a total of 20 investigations that were opened against financial institutions for suspected breaches of AML and CFT requirements. And these enforcement actions were taken against 17 financial institutions. That shows that when we first prevent and then we detect, we quickly enforce. That's the hallmark of our AML CFT regime, which again, I had mentioned is on par with international standards as defined also by FATF's assessment. Now, the license of these 17 FIs, the license of one of the FIs was revoked. So it's not just financial penalties, but also other forms of penalties to deter, to thwart, and to punish in that regard. The composition fines were imposed on 14 FIs and reprimands were issued to 2 FIs. In addition, a total of 25 investigations were opened against individuals. Enforcement actions were also taken against 11 individuals. So what I'm trying to say is that the way that we enforce, again, the third limb or the third prong, the way that we enforce is not just fines, but there's also prohibition orders, there's also reprimands, and so on and so forth. So it's a whole suite of it. So, and that again, if you tie that with the overall AML CFT framework, it's in line with international jurisdictions. Can I just ask Mr. Leong to just repeat his question with regards to Cosmic, please? You mentioned whether, please.
Mr. Leong?
Yes, sir. What I mean is that the banks currently already share client credit information on the credit bureau, right? So that is already sharing of clients' information. So what is the problem of introducing Cosmic to share information that may be related to the money laundering activities?
Just to clarify that credit info is very different to STRs. And I think Mr. Leong would also appreciate that the direct sharing of FI to FI info, that's on STRs, for example, will need to be very carefully circumscribed. Why? When I talked about this in May earlier on, members who had spoken about the bill that we passed, this House passed in May, had also expressed concerns about customer confidentiality. So we cannot, just because there is an urgent need, we move at a quick pace, a too fast a pace that we forget the concerns about customer confidentiality. Under Cosmic, maybe I assure the member that information sharing will only be allowed when customers cross stipulated thresholds for sharing, which are primarily guided by financial crime red flags in predefined risk areas. And currently, it's related to shell companies, trade-based money laundering, and proliferation financing. Again, I want to reiterate that financial institutions don't share STRs with each other, only customer info. That's an important point to note. Thank you for your questions.
Associate Professor Jameson.
Thank you, Speaker. MOS is taking questions about Cosmic, and we seem to be winding into this last segment of additional questions. If I could quickly follow up and ask a question that my honourable friend Gerald Giam had also posed about what inhibitions currently exist that would preclude real estate agencies and other non-financial institutions facing money laundering pressure from getting onto a platform such as Cosmic.
MOS Tan.
Thank you, Associate Professor James. I wanted to respond to Member Jerogam's question earlier on, so this gives me an opportunity to do so. You're talking about how Cosmic initially in the early stages by the 6 banks is sharing information amongst one another. Let me just share that currently MAS is able to share information in its possession with domestic supervisory and law enforcement authorities for, as Mr. Jeragam mentioned, for AML-CFT purposes. And this is to facilitate supervisory or investigation action. This will include information from Cosmic when it is rolled out. And where relevant, STRO, which is the Suspicious Transactions Reporting Office, which is effectively Singapore's Financial Intelligence Unit, may also share information it obtains from Cosmic with law enforcement agencies to facilitate investigations and supervision.
Mr. Leong Man Wai.
Yeah, sir, I'd like to seek further clarification from the MOS on the fines imposed on banks so far. Can I clarify that the MOS is of the opinion that our current regime, where at the moment we have only imposed $3.8 million fine on the banks, compared to the $1.45 billion deposits that are already in the system, is according to international standards?
Minister
I
Teo.
think Mr. Leong is mistaken. The $3.8 million fines was issued in relation to one case, Wirecard. MOS Alvin Tan had already pointed it out. I'm just reiterating what he has just said. It was one case, but there have been other cases. Yeah, so.
Mr. Leong.
Sir, can I clarify with Minister Josephine then, what is the total amount of fines imposed on our banks so far?
Separate the two things, sir. You are asking in the moment what is the total number of fines levied on banks. I believe we don't have the information right now. If that's something that you are seeking, perhaps I can advise you to file a parliamentary question and then we can answer that specifically. Your second question, the point that you're trying to link together, this $1.45 billion, the case is still live. That amount has not been adjudicated. It is for the courts subsequently to determine what should be done with them. And in any case, I don't think it is right to link the amount seized with the fines that are imposed on a bank on completely unrelated things. There will have to be a proper investigation as to whether there were actors in the financial sector that contributed to this web that we have uncovered. But until that has been properly settled, it is premature for you to draw any conclusions.
Ms. Sylvia Lim.
Thank you, Speaker. I have two clarifications for the Second Minister for Home Affairs. The first actually relates to something she said in her main speech about the red flags that alerted the authorities to this billion-dollar money laundering bust, if I can say it that way. She said that in 2021, there were a few suspicious transaction reports filed by financial institutions and also by other companies. So could she let us know which industries these other companies came from? Were there property agencies? Were there law firms, for example? So that's my first question, to clarify where these other companies came from that filed the STRs related to this case. The second clarification is this. Several of the persons arrested and charged were reportedly wanted by police authorities in China. And it was in relation, I think, to possible organized crime activities by these people wanted by police in China. So my question is, have the Chinese authorities been assisting us in our investigation in Singapore? And related to that, has there been any indication that any Chinese parties will be making a claim on any of the assets or funds that have been seized in Singapore?
Minister Teo.
Ms. Silva Lim for her questions. On her first, in relation to the suspicious transactions reports, They came from a variety of gatekeepers, and the usual gatekeepers that are involved include the banks, they include corporate service providers, they include real estate agents, and so there's a variety. And as to whether we connect the dots only using STRs, the answer is no. There will also be suspicious transactions, exchange of information with foreign counterparts. I cannot comment specifically to what it is in this case. It is premature for me to reveal more, but it would not be unusual. Keep in mind also that there will be other sources of intelligence. Police interact with a wide surface, and these can also help to form a picture as to what is going on. So I hope that addresses the questions.
Monsieur William.
Thank you, sir. Just to clarify again, I wonder if she could, I do not know whether there are any operational issues, but whether she could confirm whether the Chinese police authorities are actually assisting us in our investigation, and secondly, about whether there has been any indication so far whether they are making a claim on the Chinese parties are making a claim on any of the assets seized.
Specific to this case, I'm not at liberty to disclose which foreign law enforcement agencies we are working with. Suffice to say that there would be a variety, because the proceeds that potentially have been laundered through the Singapore system involve activities that were carried outside of Singapore. They could involve more than one jurisdiction. And as we cast our net wide, it would not be unusual or unthinkable for us to be cooperating with other law enforcement agencies, not confined to one country, China.
Mr. Murali Pillai.
Mr. Speaker, sir, I seek clarification from the Second Minister for Finance on two areas. First, in relation to her statement regarding the AML regime applicable to foreign companies in Singapore. May I ask if the government is minded to review its decision to exempt foreign companies which hold only property in Singapore whilst not carrying other forms of business here from the requirement to provide beneficial ownership information? This was explained by the Minister for Finance in response to a PQ I filed as striking a balance between regulatory compliance and ease of doing business. From an AML perspective, it makes sense to directly subject such asset holding companies to such requirements instead of relying on intermediaries. Second, sir, may I ask the Honourable Second Minister for Finance whether the government will be minded to consider providing a minister with powers to prescribe through subsidiary legislation businesses that should be subject to customer due diligence requirements. Prior to this police operation, I suspect not many members would even know the existence of bare brick dolls, much less the fact that these dolls were allegedly purchased for money laundering purposes. Currently, the CDD requirements are done via specific pieces of legislation. This may not be fast enough. In time to come, there could be other items which may be the money launderer's favorite. Speed would be essential to ensure our system can react to such developments, hence giving our minister the power to prescribe businesses that will have to conduct CDD may therefore help. Thank you.
Minister Indrani.
I thank Mr. Murali Pillai for his clarification. I think his question really was with respect to foreign companies which don't do anything other than own property. Should we not bring them under the ACRA regime and make them disclose any beneficial ownership? Let me explain first the current thinking behind why we don't require that at the moment. Because these foreign companies, well, the Companies Act and ACRA looks at companies which carry on business in Singapore. If you have a foreign company which doesn't carry on any business and the only thing it does is just buys a property, then strictly speaking, it's not carrying on business. It's just owning a property, and therefore it's not caught by the Companies Act regime for registration with ACRA. So in fact, such a foreign company doesn't even need to be registered in Singapore at all. It just is the entity that owns a property. And that is the reason why we don't require it to come under ACRA. But that is not to say that there would be no requirement to find out beneficial ownership of that foreign company, because when they're buying the property, the financial institutions, the real estate agents, and the lawyers who act would have to make those inquiries as part of their due diligence. And so they would have that information, and the law enforcement agencies can, if necessary, ask these intermediaries for that beneficial ownership information. That said, you know, when we do our review as part of the IMC, we will look at all relevant areas, and if anything needs to be fine-tuned or changed, we will look at it. And I think his final question was, I wasn't quite sure I've understood the full import of it. If Mr. Murali could just clarify that.
Mr. Speaker, sir, with your permission, the second area for clarification is whether the government would consider prescribing the minister with powers to issue subsidiary legislation to allow businesses to conduct CDD. This would be a bit faster than the current situation where you have specific legislation. For example, precious stones and metal dealers. Through legislation, they would now have to deal with customer due diligence requirements, just so that we can be hopefully, be at least at pace with the criminals. Thank you.
The IMC will consider that request as part of its review.
Minister Teo.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I'd like to make a further clarification to the question that was raised by member Mr. Leong with regards to the 1.45 billion. Mr. Leong was not right to, in the first place, conflate the $3.8 million with the $1.45 billion. They relate to completely different things. The $3.8 million related only to the Wirecard incident. And with respect to the $1.45 billion, I had said in my statement that these are seizures of monies in bank accounts amounting to more than $1.45 billion. This money does not belong to the bank. It is certainly not the bank's profits that you should use to weigh against the responsibility that we hold them to. This 1.45 billion has to be properly sorted out in terms of ownership. They just happen to sit in the bank accounts. They do not belong to the banks. So I hope that members understand that these two numbers have no business being talked about together. I hope that makes it clear, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Mr. Leong Manwai.
Sir, I think what the minister just said hit at the heart of our discussion today. When you want to uphold zero tolerance in money laundering, of course, you have to suppress the profit motive of the people involved, right? So although the $1.45 billion does not belong to the bank, but the fact that $2.8 billion has been placed in our system, and most of it is in the banking system, okay? And now you gave me the information that 1.45 is still with the banking system at the moment. So before, maybe now you have frozen the funds, so the funds cannot be used by the bank anymore. But in the process of allowing these funds to come into our banking system, that is a huge amount of money the banks have made, you know. If we do not take away that amount of money, that means we impose a fine on them equivalent to the amount of money they've made. Maybe that's not in line with international standard. Then we can adjust it a bit. But in terms of the amount of money we are talking about in this case, that have come into our banking system, do you know how much money the banks potentially has been making? You cannot say that these are two different issues. You know? It reflects that the regulators do not, or you do not appreciate that this is the way, you know, that the bank makes money with this whole thing, you know. So I would like to clarify, is that what you are trying to say?
Minister Teo.
So, with all due respect to Mr. Leong, I'm still trying to figure out what exactly he is saying. Nobody disputes that our financial institutions have a responsibility to uphold the strict measures that we will take against money launderers. Nobody is saying that at all. Nobody is also saying that if they were to breach their obligations, they shouldn't be taken to task. In fact, what I have presented and what MOS Alvin Tan has presented point to the seriousness with which we hold the financial institutions to their obligations. I think that part is very clear. What I seem to be hearing Mr. Leong saying is that, you have found these amounts in your system. And therefore, it must point to some action on the part of the financial institutions in facilitating this, in helping to make this happen. I'm saying that until we get to the bottom of things, this is not the right way to think about it. The correct way to think about it is that the entire machinery that we have put in place was able to uncover such a web. I mentioned this earlier in my statement and the clarifications and the response to some questions that were posed by members. Would we be happier if we had acted at an earlier stage in the investigations and then uncovered a smaller web? Or are we in a better position to have rooted out more of these activities? So we should continue to keep this number in perspective. It speaks to the strength of our system to be able to uncover these suspected criminal proceeds. And that is what we must continue to strengthen. And that is what this effort is all about.
MOS Tan.
So I just want to make a really strong point that if there is wrongdoing, we will be firm with them as we have done so in the past. Fines are one, but we have invoked other measures, including banning FIs, revoking their licenses, and as well as holding senior management to task. So there's a variety, there's a spectrum of it, and I think as what Minister Josephine Teo had mentioned earlier on, the investigations are ongoing. We cannot prematurely, and we ought not to prematurely attribute any guilt or offense on the banks prematurely until investigations have been completed. But I wanted to assure you and assure members of the House that we take firm action against errant banks, against errant financial institutions, and against the senior management of financial institutions if they are found wanting and if they are found to have contravened our strict anti-money laundering and CFT standards, which are, as I mentioned again, aligned with international standards and verified, assessed by FATF. So I think these are parameters which we need to be aware of, and these are parameters that also the financial institutions know. And as I mentioned in my ministerial statement earlier on, it is a priority for the MAS. Thank you.
Mr. Leong, if you have a new clarification, I will allow it, but I will not allow any repeat of the same clarifications you've asked. Thank you.
But I have to, sir, I have to clarify some of the things that Minister have said.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay? Yeah. Okay, first of all, Speaker, sir, I did not say that our banks have facilitated money laundering. Okay? So Minister just now have said something that sort of verge on that, border on that implications. Okay. What I'm saying is that with all the good intentions and the measures that our banks have taken and MAS have asked our banks to take, we still ended up with this case. So we have to demonstrate to our gatekeepers, and our major part, most of our gatekeepers is actually the banks, that they must do their job properly. They must continue to do their job properly. And in relation to the amount of money that has come in the system and the potential amount of profits that the banks can make from it, we must have penalties that are proportional to the potential profits that are made if in the future the whole case is that the verdict of the case has come out and it has demonstrated that some of the banks have been short on their AML measures. Okay, this is what I want to say. So what I take from the minister today is that so far only a few banks have been
you can
confirmed.
get your clarification to the point. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So only a few banks that we are very sure that they are at fault. But the other banks, we have to wait for the court. Okay, so that is what I get from the minister. Because if that's not the case, then today you can tell me what is the total fines imposed on our banks already. Am I right?
You may sit down, Mr. Leong.
Mr. Speaker, to the specific question of how much fines have been levied on the banks, I think I made it quite clear to Mr. Leong that if he would like to know the figure, he may file a parliamentary question and we will address it. Now, I think that it is not right for him to infer as to the involvement of the banks and the financial institutions in this particular case. That conclusion cannot yet be drawn. The investigations are still ongoing. So nothing that Minister of State Alvin Tan said or I said implicate the banks right now. We have only stated the facts about where the monies were found and how we seized them. That is all that we said. So it is not right for Mr. Leong to infer from his last part of his clarifications. And I think it is helpful that he acknowledged that he may have been misunderstood as saying that the banks were complicit. If that is his clarification, that he is not making a sweeping statement that our banks have been complicit, I think I welcome that clarification. Thank you.
Mr. Leong, if you would like to clarify Minister's clarification to you.
Sir, yes, that's exactly what I was saying just now. I didn't say our banks are complicit in this scheme. But I'm saying that how our rules will play out, in ensuring that our system continue to be robust and more robust in the future. Okay. So what the minister have said is that.
So, Mr. Leong, it's okay. You've clarified. You've addressed minister's clarification, so that's fine. Any other final clarifications for the ministers?